my name is Ivan. I'm a third-year PhD student in Center of Development Studies, working under the supervision of Dr. Chang on regional development and independence movements. So essentially, why do we have regional differences in development within countries, and how that can relate and can lead to why we have them, why they persist, why they're so difficult to solve, and how that can feed into a political movement for independence. And my case study is Scotland. But today I won't be talking about all of that. I'll be talking only about one bit of it, and that's regional development within capitalist countries. And we tend to start these paper zero lectures by saying why we think the topic is important. And in this particular case, I think that if we do care about living standards, about life opportunities of people, and so on, then we have to understand that the popular term postcode lottery, which basically means depending on what your postcode is of your birth, where you're going to live, will have a huge impact on your life chances. That is very much the case. And Stephen Maxwell, a Scottish, he died a few years ago, but a Scottish left-wing pro-independence politician and activist, he wrote and said, comparing different parts of Scotland, he said, the Edinburgh mental attachment to Scotland on the football field or athletics track, but in their everyday concerns, their jobs, their incomes, their hopes for their children, their anxieties about retirement, the quality of their housing, their health, they might as well live in different countries. Now, the data that I will be using does not go. So I will be looking mostly at the UK at this level. So it's MEPS1 region. So that's the Eurostat, that's European Union's Statistical Office Agency. Statistical Office, they have these regions, MEPS1, then 2, and then 3. This is 1. So this is usually called the countries and regions of the UK. This is just so we know what we're talking about. It's Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So the countries, and then England as a fourth country divided in northeast, northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber, east and west Midlands, east of England where we are, the Greater London area, southeast and southwest. Just so we know what we're talking about, all clearly some of you having been really doing this. And then I'll just quickly go through just a few indicators of this postcode lottery, with you just to see how big the problem is in some areas, not all, but in some. So in terms of life expectancy, females are the darker and males are the brighter line. So you can see that, for example, if you're born in the southeast as a female, you'll probably live on average up to 83. But if you're born in the northeast, which is the most deprived area in the UK, you'll have a few years shorter. You'll live a few years shorter. The differences are much higher for men, but this is at the aggregate level of the whole region. If we were to disaggregate further, we'd see that, say, if you're born in Glasgow, you'll live about 13 years shorter than if you're born in Kensington, which is the richest area in London. That's a full 13 years, more than a decade. And this subsumes lots of other things: health, workplace accidents, nutrition, and so on and so forth. There's a big gap there. Scotland, for some reason, has the shortest lifespan for men. I would not know why. Employment, again, huge differences in your chance to obtain useful and gainful employment and to lead a normal life. That's the percentage of the working age population that's employed. That's 15 to 64 work-able people. How many of them are working? And in the northeast, it's about 67%. In the southeast, which is, again, after all, the most developed region, it's over 76%. So there's a full 10 percentage points difference. Add to that the higher unemployment rate, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who can find a job in one region, and their equivalents, their compatriots in the other part, cannot. Income, this gross disposable household income per head, essentially what you earn plus your benefits minus your taxes plus whatever other transfers you get from non-state entities. Again, if you are in a single household in the northeast, you'll get about 13,000. In the southeast, you'll get about 16,000, and that's actually quite a lot of money. Again, if you were to disaggregate this further, you'd see huge pockets of deprivation somewhere, especially in London, for example. Final slide, just to kind of bring the point home. The percentage of individuals who live in relative poverty, the households that live in relative poverty. This is before housing costs, And again, where we are, the Northeast has about 23% of people living in relative poverty. The Southeast, it's about 12. After household costs, the mortgage or rent, as you might expect, London shoots up to the worst position in the UK. So close to 30% of the people who live in relative poverty. These are just a few figures to show that yes, there is a postcode lottery in operation in the UK, a very big one. And well, really the question is this some sort of an aberration? And does it have to be like this? Is it something that's kind of inherent in how markets work? Is this the case only in the UK, and so on? Now, I won't deal with all of those questions in depth, but well, not with the last one. This is not a UK phenomenon. This is a phenomenon in practically all countries, especially capitalist countries in the world. So the question then is why this is the case and what can be done about it. Now, there are two traditions, if you want, lines of inquiry into this. One is the mainstream one, and or neoclassical, orthodox, mathematical. The other one is the non-mainstream one. I will mostly focus on the second, but just a few words on the first one. One of the first economists who have written in the mathematical tradition about this is Alfred Weber. He was a German economist in the late 19th century, and he essentially subsumed lots of differences in between regions into transportation costs and made into it. Those who followed him, like August Lösch and later Walter Isard, kind of gave up on that more realistic line of inquiry. So Lösch, for example, assumed that we can treat a country as a level plane that has equal transportation costs in all directions and has an equally distributed population and so on. And then he started with firms equally distributed along this and how they will grow and so on. A bit difficult to see how that helps us understand regional development and the real world. But in essence, all of these models in some way or another argue that in some way the market system will equalize regional development. One argument that you might have heard is, well, if there is unemployment in one region, people will just migrate to another region where there is gainful employment to be had. There's lots of capital in one part of the country and little in another part. Capital will go where there's little of because marginal product will be higher. So essentially, in some way or another, they make these sorts of arguments. Now, 6 months ago, when I first held this lecture, I said that I will review Paul Krugman's New Economic Geography, which is the newest addition to the mainstream line. Unfortunately, as these things usually go, I still haven't done that, so I can't really say much about it. But next time, I will have written my PhD, and by that time, but for now, I really don't want to say much about it. So this is the one line, but again, this is just the newest edition. The longest bit of the whole mainstream tradition deals with pretty unrealistic models. Now, what about the other tradition? What the heterodox economists have to say about this? Now, in order to understand their arguments, and I'll mention a few names as I go through this, we have to look at two things. One is how economic development, is perceived in the heterodox tradition, and the other is how is big firm competition in capitalism, so a competition between big corporations mostly, how is that analyzed in the heterodox tradition? When you join these two together, the disparities will appear as kind of a natural outcome of how capitalism works, which is the main argument that I'm trying to get. This isn't an aberration, this is inbuilt into how the system works. Now, in terms of economic development, just very shortly, because Ustein will be talking about this in next week, was it, or 2 weeks? 2 weeks. Essentially, for me at least, economic development is about achieving high material living standards. And by that, I do not mean necessarily consumerism, but we need houses, we need medication, we need transportation, we need schools, we need education, and so clothing, heating, and so on. So we need things, lots of things and services. Now, most fundamentally for this, the most important element for this is high productivity, which is pretty clear from at least one perspective. We need lots of things, we need to produce lots of things, therefore we need high productivity. But that is only one benefit. Another benefit of high productivity is, well, if we can produce more with the same resources, perhaps we can produce the same as we used to, but with fewer resources, and therefore conserve the environment or have shorter working hours, for example. Alternatively, the people, if we still produce the same amount, the resources that used to be employed in one sector can move into another sector and diversify the economy, produce other things. And in that sense, it is extremely important for any economy to have at least some economic sectors that have high productivity, either because we want to work less, or because we want to diversify, or because we want to consume more. Essentially, and it's very important to understand, though, that not all sectors have the same ability to increase productivity at any point in time. And for those who work in low productivity sectors, such as teaching, for example, has the same productivity now as 50 years ago. So how do people in these sectors increase their living standards? Because they do. Well, essentially, they can charge more for their services or products that they sell to those who have high productivity gains. So from all these aspects, it's very important for an economy to have at least some sectors with high productivity and rising productivity all the time. And just as one graph to show that it's not the same across all sectors, this is from the UK Innovation Survey. And essentially they asked firms in these different sectors, how often do you innovate? And innovation is at the core of productivity gains, better technology, better organization, and so on. So clearly, in manufacturing and knowledge-intensive services, over 30% of the companies, this is I think for 2011, said that they innovated in some way in their product, and fewer in innovation, in process innovation. But in construction or the primary sector and so on, we see lower levels of innovation. So essentially, it's important what we produce. Now, that was one bit, so I won't go further into this economic development. The other bit that we have to understand is how this relates to big firm competition in capitalism. Now, by no means the only, but the usual picture that we get in a mainstream curriculum is that the base standard for how market economy works is this perfectly competitive market where we have lots of small producers and lots of small consumers. None of them have any market power. They can't influence prices, preferences, and so on and so forth, and they compete against each other. Now, even if we start from this assumption, we can say that during this process of competition, some of these firms will gain an advantage over other firms, either by positioning themselves better, doing better branding, having slightly better technology, or whatever, even pure luck. But they might be better at convincing the bank to give them a loan. Doesn't really matter what. But once they gain some advantage, chances are that in the next round when they compete, this advantage will help them to then get out on top again. This will give them slightly higher sales, slightly more investment, slightly higher profits, and so on, which in the next round will be, again, give them the same advantage. And over time, these advantages will accumulate. Now, as long as some firms manage to keep this up, and some firms have managed to keep this up, such as General Motors or Apple for the past 30 years, or a number of these big companies, all of the oil companies, and so on, we will get at least a few firms in the market consistently growing and eventually ending up dominating the market. The corollary of that is that the smaller firms who haven't managed to keep up with this, with the big ones, will be very hard pressed to even survive in the market, let alone thrive in the market. So in a way, natural barriers to entry form in these markets, because in order to try to assail the position of these big firms, you would have to counter their huge investments in technology, in branding, in organization, post-production services, and so on and so forth. That is way above the resources that a small firm can muster. And just an example back from my home, where my neighbor has a small firm that produces some car parts, and they sell about 800,000 euros per year. Fiat invested in Serbia, opened the factory, so asked him, can you perhaps do something for Fiat? And he said, well, no, the machine that would be required to produce the output that they need costs 5 million euros. His sales, not profit, sales are 800,000. They're just not going to enter that market. There is already a big firm that's going to supply Fiat. So that gives you an idea of of the process by which markets become dominated by a few small firms. And think of Boeing, think of Airbus, think of Intel and AMD, think of the 4 big banks in the UK or the 4 big auditing companies and so on. So all of these firms have some sort of advantage over the rest of the firms. Now, okay, so to give you an idea of how far this process has gone, so in the UK, there were about, let me tell you, 5 million businesses at the end of 2013, so 5 million firms. Now, the UK classifies firms as being big if they have more than 250 employees. Now, 6,500 businesses were big out of 5 million, and they employed about 10 million people. Now, the remaining 5 million employed the remainder of the privately employed workforce, and that's another 14 million. So you have 6,500 firms employing 10 million people, and 4 million firms employing another 14 million. This is just one example. Also, the 6,500 have bigger sales in aggregate than the remainder of the almost 5 million firms. This gives you an idea of how far this process has gone, and this isn't just the UK thing. And this is masterfully explained, the whole process of how this happens, in a book by Edith Penrose called The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, which had its, I think, 13th edition a couple of years ago. Okay. One important element to understand, though, is that when big firms, when the market gets dominated by only a few big firms, and after this, don't worry, I'm coming back to regional development. When the market gets dominated by a few big firms, the nature of competition changes. Big firms do not compete on prices against each other. They make huge investments in their technology, in their R&D, and in their machinery, in their branding, and so on. They need stability. They need to repay this. They need to know what they're going to sell and at what price they're going to sell it. If they were to reduce their price, the competitor would have absolutely no other option but to reduce their price as well. And then they would just have lower profits. So they would enter a price war. And generally, they avoid that. So instead of that, they compete because that will mess up their plan. Instead of that, they compete through better technology, better branding, better services, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, through massive advertising, etc. But we see that a part of their competition is what development is. They compete through better technology, through increased productivity, through lower cost, and so on. So a good chunk of development in capitalism is tied into big firms and how they compete. Okay, so going back to regional development, how does all this relate to that? You may be wondering. Well, we have to remember that all of this process of development, of increasing productivity and diversifying, and that happening through the competition between big firms who dominate the market and whose position is extremely difficult to assail. All this happens in actual physical space. Now, even if you assume that you have a country which is even in every respect, and you have firms popping up here and there, as they compete, which is not the case. Some regions have an advantage because of their location, because of history, and so on. But even if that were not the case, some companies would eventually win out in this competitive process. And the regions where they are located will benefit from this in terms of the higher employment, higher taxes, at least local taxes that are paid, more contracts for local small firms, and so on. Those regions which happen to have had firms that lost out in this process will be in an extremely difficult position, because essentially, if they would want to have this high productivity, high employment, high taxes, high innovation, and so on and so forth, they would either have to develop their own big firms, which is very difficult, as we said, or they would, and I'll talk about that in terms of policies, they would have to somehow get those firms to invest in their region, at the very least, to close the employment gap, which we saw as being pretty huge. So, in this sense, if this process is not mitigated, capitalism itself will create huge regional disparities. And now, perhaps, some of the data that I will show will make sense. So clearly, if we say compare the Northeast in terms of productivity, so basically the gross value added per head, we'll have it at about a bit more than 15,000. Obviously, London is way above everyone else. Then we have the southeast at over 20,000. So the southeast is a bit above the UK average. The northeast is, I think, at about 80% of the UK average. In terms of research, oh, sorry, this was just wrong order of slides. In terms of investment in research, and remember, it's big firms that have far bigger resources to invest. That was the slide that I put in the wrong place. Have far bigger resources to invest in R&D, and they're the ones who are driving innovation and development and so on. Well, just might make sense to show this first. Sorry, it's a mess. In terms of the distribution of big firms in the UK, per 10,000 residents, so just look at these. That's per 10,000 residents. London has quite a few residents, and it manages to end up at 2 firms. All the rest is at 1, but this is because this is rounded, so you would have a much bigger difference. But just in terms of even small firms, which don't have any employees, that's the number of that's proprietors. See the northeast at 467 per 10,000, London at 980, southeast 860. Small firms, again, many more because they have people who have money to sell to. In terms of medium firms, which are also very important, again, London dominates. The northeast is, again, this is rounded, so you can see a bigger difference. And then in big firms, the big chunk is located in the Greater East in London and the southeast and east of India. Now, that shouldn't surprise us that if you look at R&D in the UK, again, the southeast holds it almost a quarter. The east of England, we are 17%, and London, well. So basically, these 3 regions, which don't have, about a third of the UK population, or a bit less, account, and the northwest, which is basically Manchester here, account for a little bit more than half to almost 2/3 of research. So in that sense, it isn't really surprising that if this process of competition has left certain regions without a strong economic base and others with a strong economic base, then we will see differences in innovation, in employment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We will also see some, again, productivity per filled job. We'll also see people moving away from the poorer regions. Now in London, though, they move out because of congestion, so it's not all sunshine for the more developed regions. But most of these people move to the southeast, which is basically just outside of London. But if you look at the northwest and the northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber, the worst hit regions, most deprived regions, we see a constant outflow of population, people searching for better jobs and not always finding them, just to make that clear. Now, data on regional investment, I'm sure it exists. I haven't been able to find it yet. But people do refer to there being much more investment in the more developed regions and more capital flows towards developed regions, quite contrary to what we would assume, because that's where the investment opportunities are. That's where possibilities lie. The whole, and I will supply a reading list afterwards. It will be on our website as well. But this whole process is masterfully explained by Stuart Holland. He's still alive. He's a UK politician and economist. He's kind of the left wing of old Labour, and he kind of presents much more empirical evidence on this and how firms make decisions and so on, and comes to these conclusions. Okay, so. Well, since I have it here, I might as well go to these ones as well. What's the effect of this? Just as one element. This is 97, so we can get to 2001. This is of all the household income, how much do they earn themselves, how much do they get from other sources, which would either be benefits or help from non-state institutions that help households. Well, in London and kind of the Greater East, we're talking about over 80% of what households earn, they earn themselves. As you move to the more deprived regions, kind of this falls to less than 70 in Wales. Scotland is doing slightly better. Please interrupt me if I'm going too quickly through something or something's not clear. This is the other kind of the flip side of this is how much do they pay in taxes, since there is a progressive income tax system in the UK. Clearly, those with higher, to the extent that it's still working. But it is to an extent those with higher incomes will pay more, and as you move into the desert, that basically exists between the Greater East and Scotland, you see yet, back to the first slide, of everything you earn, what's the percentage you get in benefits? So, in the worst hit regions, we're talking about a quarter or more of everything the household earns is actually benefits from the state, whereas in the more developed ones. So essentially, the poor regions depend on redistribution for their investment, for their material living standards, for their NHS, and so on and so forth. If this were cut, basically this bit of the UK would, I don't know, maybe it's not possible to estimate, but it would probably kind of go back to the level of, I don't know, some East European country, for example. But if you cut out all the things it gets from the central budget. Is that okay? Good. Now, so it's 1:35. I do have a bit about regional policies, which I can go through, or we can just move on to questions, either if I went too quickly through something or didn't clarify, or if you just have some further questions, or I could go through the regional policies if you want. But thank you for your attention.
Why don't you go a couple of minutes over some of the, so we can have an idea of what could be done about?
Okay, so the first question, should something be done? That will depend on your moral position and on your policy choices. And so I personally think something should be done about this. Several things can be done. The first is to simply ameliorate the consequences. So you're saying, yes, some regions will be poor. These ones, they used to be better off until the deindustrialization in the 80s, but they were behind this, the Great Disease. So basically just say, well, sorry, kid, you were born in Glasgow, you're going to live 13 years less than someone there, but at least we'll provide you with some unemployment and housing benefits and a common standard for healthcare, for example. So a number of ameliorating policies. The same goes for infrastructure investments and so on, airports, railroads, and so on. That's one option, and that is being done in most democratic advanced countries, at least to an extent. The different option would be to try to change the structure. And different types of policies have been attempted. In the 30s, with the Great Depression, which hit hard, especially the Northeast and Northwest and Wales and parts of the Southwest because of mining, for example, we have hundreds of thousands of unemployed people. So what the government attempted was to stimulate workers to move out of those high unemployment regions into lower unemployment regions. For example, you can offer help to households to move, or offer them, temporary housing somewhere, things like that. So a number of stimuluses to get people to move. As you might expect, people aren't too prone to leaving where they were born and leaving their friends and going into the unknown and so on. So this really didn't achieve much, but it was an attempt. The other option would be to try to get big firms to invest in the poor regions, or to try to help the poor regions to develop their big firms themselves. Now, the second bit didn't work. It has been attempted in the UK and in other countries for a long time. Firms were given capital subsidies. They were given part of the wages that they paid out were covered by the state, and a huge number of other things. But essentially, it's not enough to help them overcome the enormous advantages that established competitors have, both in terms of the technology and in terms of their brand or whatever, but also in terms of their market power. Because if a firm does start to pose a threat to the big players, they have many ways to kill them dead in their tracks. Either to threaten their suppliers, that they'll if you supply our competitor, you won't supply us, and we're bigger customers, we will stop supplying their competitor. They can undercut their prices because they can actually withstand that because they're more cost effective and so on. And that's, at least according to Holland, the main reason these sorts of policies didn't work. They effectively just pumped huge amounts of resources into big firms, into small firms, and didn't really have an effect. Other more interventionist policies have been tried as well, such as, for example, forbidding big firms to invest in already developed regions. In the UK, this was called the Industrial Development Certificate. So essentially, if you wanted to open an office or a factory in, well, the region, mostly the southeast and certain developed regions, you would have to apply for a license if the office or the factory was big enough. And the idea was to deny you the license, but to let you invest if you want to say invest in the northeast or the northwest. Now, the big problem with that, though, was that by the time capitalist countries tried out these sorts of policies, investment was kind of open throughout the world. So why would I go to a poor region of my own country where I could get slightly some subsidies and some slightly cheaper work, when I can actually go to a country where I can pay someone $1 per day? So what we see is big firms skipping the poorer regions of their own countries and investing in their poor countries, because they can get even cheaper labor, and also through transfer pricing they can make enormous benefits. So this has been attempted and kind of hasn't worked. It's managed mostly in the advanced capitalist countries to keep the disparities from increasing further, but not really too much to narrow them down. And there were suggestions that actually we need a far more kind of socialist approach to nationalize some companies or to use state-owned companies and so on, but this never happened. So we don't know whether it would have worked or not. All that is gone now, basically, with the neoliberal turn-in policies, and now we have regions attempting to kind of cluster small firms in the hope that somehow help them win out in the marketplace. It's currently being done, say, in Scotland. I have yet to look at how this has worked over the past 10 years. But at least based on some data, they really haven't managed to kind of make the jump. So yes, that was the policies. And questions?
So you said that one of the regional policies were offering incentives for people to relocate from the high unemployment regions to the regions with lower unemployment rates.
Yes.
But this wouldn't actually aid in the benefit of the country. It would actually make it more polarized. It would actually lead to segregation, to further inequality within the country. So even though you're aiding the development of certain parts, it's you're actually also making other parts worse off.
Yeah, because there isn't, as far as I know, there isn't a lot of data on which people actually move, but there seems to be evidence that, of course, it's younger, better educated people who will move, mostly males as well. So you're getting, and you can have problems in the more developed region as well, because then there's someone getting this influx and you have to provide infrastructure, housing, transport, and so on and so forth to get congestion. But there, on the other hand, you're leaving a region without young people, or say with women who then cannot work and because they have to take care of the kids because the father is somewhere else. And in my country, where this process has gone far further than here, you have a whole chunk of Eastern Serbia is basically depopulated. So you have hundreds of villages that are completely empty, or they have only 65 years and older people. There are no incentives for them to move, but people move because the whole area is deprived. So yes, but it's never happened at a huge enough scale to know what would happen. But yes, it seems very plausible that it really would produce as many problems as it solves. Okay.
So I just wanted to clarify your argument as to why the trend towards regional inequality has been increasing over decades. So is your argument that as globalization has increased over decades, so regional inequality has because of what you just said about
Skipping over.
Yeah, exactly. You can't incentivize firms to invest, or are there other reasons as well why over the past few decades we've seen this increasing trend?
It's a good question. My intuition would be that it's two things. One, we've anyway had a turn towards more neoliberal internal policies, with, for example, the industrial development certificates were abolished under the Thatcher government. So to the extent that they worked, not always, but they were abolished completely. Other controls on investment in Italy, for example, they had obligatory planning between big firms and the government on the big firms' investment plans. So if they wanted investment, they had to submit it to the relevant department and then negotiate. Among other things, the idea was to steer investment toward the south of Italy, which is extremely deprived. Again, if you cut off central government subsidies, that it would become like North Africa or something level of bill. So it had a cut in all of these policies, had a reduction in welfare policies. There is a paper, I don't have it here, but there's a paper that analyzed as well the austerity measures in the UK and how they impacted different regions differently. And as you might expect, if you cut benefits and so on, that will hurt the poor regions more. And on top of that, you had the free flow of capital with firms simply skipping over the poor regions. Because why would you pay a worker the minimum wage in the UK when you can pay them the minimum wage in Bangladesh? So the hope, on top of that, there's also the issue that manufacturing has become far more capital intensive than labor intensive, and manufacturing is the most mobile sector. But it's actually shedding jobs just because the technology is advancing and you don't need that many workers. How are you going to, move them? What are you going to move? Right? They're just going to invest in upgrading their existing plant, not opening new jobs. So yeah, I think it's a confluence of these things. I will be writing a chapter on what can be done in the current situation, but I can't say. I mean, I can just give you some ideas of now, but not a firm argument or a structured argument. Sorry.
So the government plays quite a big role in our economy, and possibly some of its services can't be moved. You can't move all the nurses up into the north. There are some parts of the government that could be moved up.
Yeah.
Does that?
It is done. I think the whatever the name of the authority that issues the driving licenses, it's not in London. There are, and countries have tried that. I think a chunk of the Norwegian state administration is in Bergen, not in Norwegian, right? Yeah, I think I'm not sure which part, but I think a bit of it. And the UK also distributes this, but I mean, the biggest, as far as I know, the biggest employer is the NHS, and you said, I mean, that's based on need, not on shipping nurses to the northeast. So it helps. It's certainly good, but I don't think it can fundamentally solve it. You have military bases as well, which create employment, but really, I mean, you have countries where, say, the Supreme Court is not in the capital and things like that, but it's not really nearly enough, I think.
I think when you present like the way to attack the problem, like in the metaphors with the industries and the region, there is an implicit assumption that I think it must be explicit. I mean that you assume that an industry creates linkage backward and forward.
Which it doesn't necessarily do in the region.
Exactly.
That's an additional point.
And in that case, it would be useless if I think industries are linkage.
That's an additional problem. It relates to so in previous times you could actually try at least getting a big company to link up to the local economy. Today, most free trade agreements start to forbid that sort of thing. And even if you tried it, and even if you didn't have a free trade agreement, well, the other country would. So if you're choosing between country and country, you just move a couple hundred kilometers with modern transportation links. It's not that big of an issue. So yes, you're absolutely right. And in regional policies, apparently one of the mistakes that was made was this implicit assumption that if it helped something in a city, it will in a city. First of all, they assume that you can just help whatever and that it will create linkages. Clearly, some industries don't create many linkages. And then they tried estimating which industries create more or less, that sometimes works, sometimes not. But the assumption was that on the top of this mistake, the assumption was that it would create linkages locally, not necessarily. Forgot what's his name. Hans Singer, the development economist, he was not the first one, of course, but he pointed out this problem very clearly in the late 1940s. He was writing about the benefits of U.S. investments in foreign countries. His argument is actually the enclave that they make, like and say around the mine or something, as completely decoupled from it has no linkage to the local economy, and should actually be considered as a part of the U.S. economy, not as a part of the local economy. If you look at the economic activity of what they're doing. So yes, that's an additional problem. You see that today in the cluster policies that are attempted. My impression is, for now at least, that they assume that if it clusters a few firms here, they will start affecting the local economy. It's not really explored. Can the local economy, even if you could convince a high-tech company to go to a deprived region of the country, what in heaven's name can it buy from that deprived region? In terms of what, say, a high-tech company. The same with big firms. If they do invest in a poor region, say in a factory or something, they're likely to use their suppliers. They're kind of already the biggest other suppliers or somewhere else. So yes, it's an additional reason. For me, I'm currently led to the conclusion that the situation is pretty bleak, but I have yet to to start writing up a PhD. We'll see what conclusion it is.
You talk about relative discrepancies quite a bit, but you don't really talk about absolute values. And I guess what we might care about is absolute levels of whatever. And so the question is, why are you concentrating, I guess, so much on relative discrepancies rather than absolute levels?
I'll have to come up with the answer to that before I submit the PhD. I don't know, because partially, I guess, because I'm focusing on capitalist countries, and although there is more absolute deprivation than we assume, it's still not the major issue. So in the UK, you have about 500,000 people at least who are using food banks. So basically, this is insane that you have one of the richest countries in history that has 500,000 people who don't have enough to eat. There's probably more than that. But comparatively to the relative deprivation, it's not the key issue, I think, when discussing this. Besides, this will be operational whatever the kind of absolute level is. If you have an advanced capitalist country, you'll have a relative discrepancy. If you have a poor country, you'll have this even more because the poor country can't fund all of these policies. This is some kind of an answer, but it's a good point. I have to perhaps make explicit whatever is implicit in my head when I went for relative discrepancy. I suppose the kind of relative poverty and so on, that there would be data on absolute poverty. I know that there is data, I don't know where it is, on say, the number of people who don't have enough to eat and so on, that would certainly also correspond to this. Although again, when you disaggregate it, you see that some of the most deprived regions in the UK are parts of London. Which had factories which moved out, and then suddenly you don't have anything and you have a labor force that's not trained for anything else. So you would have these sorts of things.
Would you also bring in the idea that inequality in itself, possibly, as some people suggest, causes problems for everyone in the society? Just in itself, that inequality, would you also bring that idea?
Alicia, who's sitting next to you, will hold the whole lecture on inequality, so she's probably far more qualified than I am to answer that. I guess my answer would be yes. It wastes human resources, to use that horrible term. It creates lots of social problems. It creates envy. It creates a feeling of injustice. So in a huge number of ways, it is both a cause and a consequence, among other things, of this. So basically, Alicia will talk about inequality in terms of classes, in terms of what causes inequality in general. My point is, among other things, even inequality is concentrated, as in the poor ones, on average, are more located, whatever, here than here. So we must never forget that there is actual physical space around us. Hope that answers it a bit. Any more questions? No, sorry, you still haven't asked the question. So
I think one of the arguments for HS2
for what?
high-speed 2, the train line.
Oh, okay.
Big infrastructure.
Okay.
I was wondering, we haven't heard of it.
I think I have heard of it now that you say high speed link, but
one of the arguments for it was that it might rebalance the economy.
I don't know. I'd have to know more about the specific project, but I guess it would depend on who supplies the parts, who does the labor. Probably the building itself might be carried out by local workers. But the question is, and Francois, who I don't read French, but there are some things that have been translated into English, who's also one of the key regional economists in the 20th century. It's mostly forgotten, among other things, because people don't read French anymore, but me included. But he was kind of probably one of the top economists in the 20th century. And he wrote, I think, extensively about these linkages and how people forget that, it depends what you link. You might even deprive the local area if you increase, the links to a far more developed region with better, more cost-effective companies and so on, which can suddenly supply the local region, while there go your local suppliers. But that will depend on the specific. I think there were studies that Stuart Hahn refers to in Italy in the 70s, when they were building the autostrada or whatever, one of their big highways, about whether that would stimulate more decentralization of production because you have better links to your markets, or whether it would actually wipe out what local production there is because you link it to high developed regions. And I don't know what happened in the end, but the conclusion was really firms will have completely different. I mean, they'll have a range of incentives, and it will depend on the specific firm even what it will decide to do. We cannot assume that they will automatically rush to lower their location costs, for example. Is that kind of an answer? No, not really, because your question was about the high-speed link, which I don't know about. But I guess the answer is it depends.
You mentioned food banks, and that's very severe deprivation. And possibly, if you increase the wealth of some of the more deprived regions, that's not going to affect very much that very bottom end of the income distribution.
Again, this is probably more in Alicia's bit.
You can give some spoilers.
I can give one some.
Some spoilers.
Some spoilers.
Yes,
No.
absolutely right.
It's been a while since I heard the lecture. I think there is a general problem with getting development to affect the lowest strata, and that I think because essentially in capitalism you have to fight severely for your bit of the cake, and the poor ones, the poor parts of the population are anyway very politically, I mean, it's far more difficult for them to organize. So my kind of impression is that in most of the cases where the lowest income strata benefited from something was when governments who had the support of those slightly above them, so say unionized workers, but who aren't severely deprived, but they're right, made programs which covered everyone. Not because the very poor came out and managed to push through something. But that's just my impression. So I guess it would depend on government policy more than anything else. I could be utterly wrong about it.
No, you're right, and your question is absolutely correct. If you have those generalized policies, you will probably benefit the ones that are already benefiting more. So it depends a lot on what kind of policies you use.
And one additional, just an interesting bit is that also policies that benefit everyone seem to be far more difficult to dismantle than policies that only benefit a few people. So compare the NHS with social benefits, and clearly there will be far more resistance to dismantling the NHS, for example, than dismantling welfare benefits. That's one of the arguments for universal income as well, because that will benefit everyone. So, but yes, I think it depends on government policy. Sorry, final thing. Yeah, there is an article that I can send you by Mike Danson. He's a Scottish economist, and they did this research on the multifaceted causes of the deprivation in East Glasgow, and how a lot of the programs that aim to do actually miss out on all the ways in which these people have trouble entering the labor market, or even knowing what their rights are, and so on. So yes, sorry.
I totally forgot what I was going to say.
Anyone else?
Okay, remember the last question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to stay here if no one comes. If someone wants to chat more, or if you want to go, you can go. That's obviously understood.
Yeah. So you talked about measures sort of right against blocking funding or the government controlling the big companies' plans and shifting funding to the poor areas. We didn't really talk. So yeah, we didn't really talk about something that I think might be quite important, which is that education and retraining, and actually attracting businesses and funding by the human resources, as you said before. And so that's more of like a grassroots sort of project, as I think about it. I guess, what are your thoughts about that?
From what I've read about, in terms of the analysis of the effect of these policies, although I can't give you all the quotes now, it's been a while, all the references in it. It works a bit, but essentially, if an area, say, lacks 300,000 jobs, right, you can retrain a chunk of that, but the others will be retrained for different to train unemployment, really. Because, as I said, companies will not necessarily go to the poor regions, or they might just not chase locational benefits. So you might get good infrastructure and labor subsidies in the poor region, and a well-trained labor force. And it might even be beneficial for a company to go there and reduce its labor costs and get, a well-trained workforce. But companies simply don't always chase these locational benefits. They might have, a big competitor that they have to worry about. There's a limited amount of time that managers can invest in this. You might not be able to convince any of the middle-level managers to move to the private area, and you do need them because if you lack them in one region, that's something that kind of comes with experience and so on. Also, specialized skills in maintenance and so on. It's much easier today with fast speed lanes and so on, but it's still difficult. Just think of yourself. Would you go to some, godforsaken village in the Scottish Highlands? I wouldn't. So it's the same with doctors. Lots of countries will actually have doctors doing residency if they went through the state system, actually do the residency in the 4 regions as a part of kind of repaying what they did, because otherwise, why? So I think it's good. It can't hurt, but I don't think it's the fundamental solution. Anything else?
I think
We should
stop. But yeah, if anyone would like to still talk to Ivan or to us, we will stay here for a couple of minutes.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.